You all set? Floor is yours.
We're good?
Yep.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to call the Door County Board of Supervisors meeting to order on Tuesday, February 23rd at approximately 10:12 a.m. Would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag? I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Cute. That's cool.
That's
Got a lot going on.
Bulls in charge of going to Mars.
Okay, so what do we have?
Got off the ground.
18 present, 3 absent. Okay. Presentation of the agenda. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Correspondence. You'll note in your packet there are 4 pieces of correspondence, the unassigned fund balance, and 3 email letters. Public comment.
okay. For the public comment, we have 2 ways for those that are interested in participating. If you are online using WebEx, you can actually raise your hand using the system, and I will recognize you and unmute you. Likewise, if you are on the phone, you can hit *3, and I will then recognize you and mute you or unmute you, and then you can speak. I will ask 2 more times if there's anyone who'd like to speak. Okay, I do have a call-in user that would like to speak. I have you unmuted. You have the floor for 3 minutes.
Good morning to the Door County Board. Thank you. This is Don
Call-in
Frick.
user, you just raised your hand. You have the floor.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this me? Hello? Yeah, I just raised my hand, but am I connected?
Nope, you have the floor. We have the sound now. Go ahead.
Great. I thought I might have been disconnected there. Okay, Don Frick, 8305 Quarterline Road, Fish Creek, Wisconsin. I'm very flattered that my publicly expressed opinions, ideas, and political views were liked so much that they may have inspired another Door County citizen to correspond to the board. I might argue on some other venue about definition of a past U.S. president's greatness, where inaction has led to the deaths of 500,000 U.S. citizens and adversely filtered down to the county and our own limited ability to address a viral pandemic. I'm still awaiting being personally named and placed on any county committee agenda for discussion about sedition and violations of the oath of office with regard to 15 GOP Wisconsin legislators with their letter to the Vice President Mike Pence, asking him to effectively, nonpartisanly cancel every vote of every Wisconsin citizen this past January 5th. So, and I'm still seeking a county resolution on the question. Though the recorded audio wasn't clear enough for me to distinguish the supervisor's identity, while I was listening to supervisor's response at the last legislative committee. The supervisor issued a call for civility, appeared to be upset that discussions of policy named particular individuals, such as I just did, and but while she was calling for a wider discussion, I'd be happy to come for wider discussion on any of the issues I bring up, but there's no way under the rules of the board governing citizen participation that seems like it's ever going to happen. So I guess, I'd like to see some change there where when a citizen brings an issue, they're allowed to come and speak. The newspaper issue, she made a comment about that after saying she didn't understand the issue. But she still had an opinion. Lastly, on the topic of February Black History Month, inclusion, equity, fairness, and racial disparities being a public health issue, I'm still, it seems like this is going to be put off till next February when Black History Month rolls around again. But in the interim, I'd like to ask the board to invite the new executive director of Health of Door County for a series of presentations on problems in the county that they are addressing on a limited budget that are every bit as serious as however much money the county is allocating for the Door County Economic Development Corporation at the time. And I think Help of Door County is an organization that the county should be supporting at least equally to Door County Economic Development Corporation, who totally ignores labor and, is there just for business interests and profits and forgets about the rest of the county and labor, from healthcare workers to teachers to shipyard workers to carpenters, and then they want to dictate about, workforce housing and a few other things like this without inviting the people that they're pretending to represent. So thank you for listening, and that's it for today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? For the third and final time, is there anyone else who would like to speak? Okay, with that, we have ended the public comment.
Thank you. Is there any supervisor's response? Approval of the minutes of January 26, 2021 regular meeting. Minutes.
What did you ask me?
Minutes.
Let's get there.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any changes, additions, deletions, comments, grammatical remarks, other omissions, or errors that anybody would like to bring up? If not, by voice vote, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you. County Administrator.
Okay, the monthly report has, I guess, what we consider all the updates. I guess this, if those are any questions on that, I can cover those. But again, I went over in some detail the monthly report. And again, I guess I'll return to our standard format where the memo will be included. And unless there's any questions, I guess I will not cover it in any significant detail. Moving on, unless there's any questions on the monthly report. If not, I'll move on. Just in terms of the update on COVID, just a couple of things, and then I know, I believe Dan is online. He can provide an update. But at the admin meeting this past week or last week, we actually discussed our status in terms of our operations. And we're going to, I guess, remain under the status quo at least through March before we start looking at opening the buildings or changing our operations. Again, just for the public, we are open for appointments and we are conducting full business, but our buildings are, I guess, right now locked unless you have a scheduled appointment, and we'll continue that through March. This another update, just in terms that was discussed also at admin and was also discussed last month at county board, is that we are looking at potential expenses related to the vaccine and the implementation of the vaccine. Again, we talked about staffing with EMS in terms of the projected cost for that. And we're also looking in public health of adding some additional nursing staff that also can serve as a backup for administering the vaccine. I'm bringing this up just as an FYI because there's obviously going to be a cost related to it. We don't know if these costs will be, I guess, covered or not based off the new funding that's coming through the federal government, if it's passed or not. But it's one of those things where we plan for the worst and hope for the best. But we don't have any exact cost estimations yet until we know how the vaccine's rolled out and what we need in terms of total staffing. If you recall, last month, we had the worst case scenario of about $130,000 from EMS. And then we're looking at a potential, right now, potential cost of another 20,000 through public health, should we have to add on additional nursing staff for the vaccine in terms of it goes into the summer. So it's just more an FYI for right now that we're monitoring that. And obviously, as we learn more and how it's conducted and how much resources we're expending, we'll keep that in the board up to date. With that, I will, Dan Kane's online. I'll have him do this a quick update. Dan, I have you unmuted and you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Dan here. I will give a brief high-level overview of where we are at with COVID. Statistically, active known cases in the state right now sits at 8,629, with 6 of the B117 variant from England. No other variants have been noted in Wisconsin. The South Africa or the Brazil variant have been found in Wisconsin to date. Locally, we have 15 active known cases as it sits today. As far as testing is concerned, from the statewide perspective, we have a 7-day average positivity rate of 2.6%. And this is really encouraging when we see we're down from about 10% at the start of this year. That's a really encouraging number. The state was looking to be under 3%. And we're sitting there now, so that's definitely encouraging. As far as local testing, the demand did decline significantly throughout the last several weeks and months. So the decision was made to stand down the Wisconsin National Guard testing sites that would go on usually through early March. Worked with Door County Medical Center on that and determined they could capture any gaps that would be noted in testing and be able to cover those for us, as they are also seeing a downward trend in testing. As far as vaccine, from a statewide perspective, the state is still receiving over 350,000 requests for doses weekly, with a weekly allocation of around 75,000 doses. So there's still quite a gap there between supply and demand. This 75,000 doses a week is expected to increase to over 100,000 doses in the next coming weeks. We don't have an exact date or how much, but that's expected to happen soon. Statewide perspective in terms of the goal is to vaccinate 65% of the eligible population. 20% of Wisconsin's population is under the age of 16 and is not eligible for the vaccine at this time. To date, we've given 1,186,325 doses. That includes both first and second doses in the state. So 13.9% are first doses, 6.1% are second doses. So 6.1% of the state has been fully vaccinated. Again, the goal of being 65% or higher. Locally, with vaccine, our local requests, and don't hold me to these numbers, but this is general, requests somewhere around 700 requests weekly. We can certainly handle that and certainly more if we needed to. And we're getting allocated about half of that, 300 to 350 a week from the state at this time for our vaccine clinics, just with the county. To date, we sit at 7,614 shots given to Door County residents. That equates to 19.5% of residents have received at least 1 dose, and 8% have received 2 doses and have completed their vaccine series in Door County. Currently, only 6 counties are ahead of Door County based on a percent of population vaccinated. And the leader is Ashland County at 21.5%, and we're at 19.5%. So to close then, I would not be doing my job as a backup Sue if I did not remind you that we should all continue our good hand hygiene, distancing, and mask wearing. And with that, at the end of my report, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions, anybody?
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, everyone.
Any other questions on anything that Ken reported on? Okay.
Oh,
There is.
checking data, it's not registering on, it's on the screen, but it's not on this screen. Hit reset once. Let's see if we can
This one or this one?
Reset. that one.
reset that.
Got it.
Video game is not working up here.
Stand by.
Supervisor info, let's
Okay, so my comment is in reference to the administrator's report on broadband study. I'm going to request that you specifically make sure you include Starlink, satellite internet system that just went up and running in the beta test right now. I have had it for almost 2 months. I have done an informal polling of a variety of different service providers, customers that throughout the county, as well as Northeast Wisconsin, people that I know with different types of services, and it has beat every last one of them. Instability, speed, functionality, installation. It is absolutely, at best, a 10-minute install for the average homeowner that has some level of internet activity knowledge. It is not that difficult. The biggest issue is getting it into the house. That was somewhat of annoying, but I have the ability to do that. And it's, you know, it's up and coming, and it seems to be working very well for me, besides the 3 services I currently used to use.
Supervisor Goldberg.
Elizabeth?
Yes, just a comment, acknowledgement and a thank you. I've gotten a lot of feedback from constituents for the COVID clinics. Just a thanks to public health, calling back everyone that had questions. I heard the response on that was phenomenal. And how they fairly managed the list of people who were canceled and then rescheduled. The efficient, well-run clinic experience, I heard from constituents, it was easy. It kept them calm. It kept them moving along. And lastly, I don't know if a lot of people are aware of the amount of volunteers that help with these clinics and how flexible they were. They stepped up on very, very short notice. And I'm just very proud of public health and so thankful. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just hoping to get a little bit of an update on the library system. Are we still talking about libraries locked till the end of March, or is it possible for people to be, make appointments and get computer time at the libraries and get books and things? Thank you.
Actually, thank you, Supervisor Boltman. That is, the libraries are going to go by appointment. So right now, the building has been where you just interact with the building and drop off your books, and you can do a pickup, but they are going to go back again to limited access, this in terms of following building capacity. But yeah, starting on March 1st, you'll see that the libraries will be made, I guess, in a sense, kind of open, but it'll be open with limited access in terms of how you interact. And also you should still plan on scheduling appointments if you'd like to use the computer and so forth.
Ken?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Boltman, for asking about the library, because that jogged my memory. I had a question about that too. Anyway, who sets up the library's operation standards? Does the county board, I don't ever remember us as a county board sitting down and saying, you will be open, or we want it to be open at this time, and this is how we're going to do it. I don't remember that. And I had somebody call me and they were upset with, they couldn't get an answer they were being told by the people at the library that the county board controls when they're open and when they're closed and that. And I said, I don't think so. I think they're semi-autonomous, but I said, I'm not sure. I'll ask at the next county board meeting. So how exactly does it work? Who sets up the hours and the standards of operation?
Sure. So that's actually a great question. The library board is semi-autonomous. And you're correct in that fashion. So actually the director can make recommendations, but it's actually the library board who actually makes that decision in terms of the hours of operation. Again, we can give input in terms of, obviously with COVID, we've talked with that and we've worked with the library board in terms of restricting access and everything. So it's been strong communication, but it ultimately is up to the library board in terms of that fashion.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anybody else? Okay, well, we're moving down. Before we start the resolutions, we're going to go to the first special report, which is the Carlson Detman Consulting.
Sure. So let me just give context as Patrick comes up. Patrick Glenn is with Carlson Detman. It's a subsidiary of Cunningham Butler. But in our budget, we had included what we consider a comp structure review. And it's that when we first did our major revision, it was back in 2016, where we did a comprehensive review of our entire structure. And then it was scheduled at the 5-year mark to have a review to make sure that we're staying, on course. So this is a pretty significant project for us as a county. Obviously, employees consider pay as one of the many aspects in terms of what they value. So before we got too far into it, I asked Patrick to come up just to provide context of what the scope of the project is and also to give you context of what's happening within the marketplace itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a presentation and I'm going to give him the mouse and the floor. So let me just start this up and I'll share the screen.
Can everybody hear me okay? That's usually a foundational question, right? And especially in this day and age with our masks. So there's some familiar faces in the room, of course, but I know that just remembering faces from days gone by that, if there's any questions just about the pay plan in general, happy to try to touch on those. It's going to be less on that today and more geared towards marketplace concerns and setting the stage, I think, for when we come back with the results of this market update of some of those questions we might have to wrestle with in terms of the challenges you're dealing with. The intent of what we're trying to go through today is one, to give you an overview of the current project, that this is a market update, not a full classification and compensation study that was done before. When we do a classification and compensation study, there's a huge investment of time and effort on the part of the employer to collect the job documentation, meeting with the departments and those sorts of things, and then analyzing all of the jobs. It's a very important piece, but you've also done a pretty decent job of trying to maintain that in the years we've done this. Occasionally we'll get a reclassification request. We look at the job content. We think it fits here. And it just helps you maintain that so you don't have to keep doing large versions of studies into the future. But we also want to touch on some of those current or future workforce challenges that you're going to be facing. And it's going to be significant and it's going to be profound. And hopefully, as we look at the data, that will become more clear. I'm going to walk you through, and in fact, there's a section of this presentation that is very data heavy. When I put those up on the screen, a copy of this presentation, Ken has a copy, and he might make sure that you get a copy, or somebody will make sure that you get a copy of that electronically. That I'm not going to go through every single line on the data. But I want you to have the complete set of data so you know what we're talking about for context. But if I were to go through every line, you'd be asleep in about 5 minutes, and I don't want that. We'll wait 10 minutes for that to happen. And then as we wind down, setting that stage for the necessary conversation as it relates to compensation philosophy and how some of these decisions or some of these barriers that you're talking about today, how that might play into the overall compensation philosophy, and then just setting it up for the next steps as well. And so just kind of a quick, very brief overview of the prior project. And again, I don't want to get inside the window here for it to move to the next slide. There we go. So last time through, we looked at 29 benchmark employers. And that seems like a lot, you know, in comparison. But when we look at this, and I'll have a slide a little bit later on, the different jobs have different marketplaces, different employers. You know, if I'm comparing the county to a city, there's a whole bunch of jobs that just don't line up with cities. You know, cities don't have human services departments. They don't have, in many cases, you know, dispatch operations. A lot of those have been funneled to counties, and I can keep going down the list. But the point is that more doesn't necessarily mean we're matching every single job, but there are some jobs in your organization that are fairly common. So when you look at clerical staff, streets or highway maintenance workers, mechanics, accounting type positions, that every organization, or at least most organizations, tend to have those. And so then we tend to broaden our view of the world. We also measured the market at that point for public and private sector data. And again, just as every single employer doesn't have the same set of jobs, there's not a private sector equivalent to every job. You know, most of your sheriff's department, for example, there's not a private sector equivalent. So we focused our attention then on the public sector data for those particular jobs. And we ended that process with, you know, almost 60 benchmark jobs that we were able to confidently and reliably match to the marketplace. And we built a pay structure for you. And the structure that you adopted was a hybrid structure in our wording, that the steps from the beginning to the control point, that middle of the structure, is step-based. It's more regular and predictable. And then anything beyond that was a performance-based structure. And in doing so, and as I alluded to just a couple moments ago in terms of the work that you've done since, that every single job we've evaluated and continue to evaluate on behalf of the county, we look at everyone through the lens of 5 main criteria, and everything else from there is really where the work happens. You know, so when I look at thinking, challenges, and problem solving, there's 2 sub-factors to that, but we're looking at the types of problems that employees have to deal with on a regular and ongoing basis, and the type of responses that they have to give. And there's gradations in terms of how we view each of those elements. I must have hit a key or something. Decision-making over what slice of the organization. How much decision-making influence do they have on the organization, or is it limited to their job or to their department? The interactions. Who am I working with and speaking with inside and outside the organization? And, you know, what's the context of that, and what does the impact of those communications have on the organization, on the flow of information or data? We then look at the work environment. What are the types of things that can hurt you? And what are the physical requirements of the job? And then that last piece, well, I must have it set on a 30-second. There's a couple of my slides I have on 30-second timers. I shouldn't. That the formal preparation experience isn't what does the employee possess. Sometimes that doesn't line up. Sometimes it is a matter of what is expected of that job. And the duties and responsibilities really should inform the answer. So when I look at thinking, challenges, decision-making, and interactions, those 3 things alone should give me a pretty decent sense of the type of education you need to fill that job moving forward. And it's a pretty reliable measure in our experience. That's like as a very quick overview of the prior project. I'm going to spend probably another little bit here talking about some of these challenges that you have in the workforce, because they're very real. I looked through my old presentations for the county, and we had a similar slide in here when we delivered the project. We've since updated it. But if you recall, if we remember before COVID, you know, our labor market was pretty darn hot. You know, trying to find the people to fill, you know, not only here in the county, but you know, if I recall correctly, was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there was a huge discussion county-wide, not county proper, but the full county, with a lot of your businesses. Where do we find the talent to open up, you know, for what we're trying to deal with here? Just took my tool away from you. Well, I don't want to look at myself. No. Okay. So that yellow line that you see up there are the number of jobs, then being laid off or discharged, it's an employee's marketplace. You can see those gray bars, those are our last 2 recessions. We don't have this one mapped out yet because we don't know if we're out of it. And we won't know we're out of it until we get a little ways down the road. But the point is that those 2 lines tend to converge on each other. Recession hits, people get laid off, they're looking for work. The county's recruitment efforts get just a little bit easier because you got a little bit more people out there in that marketplace. But what I want to show you is the post-COVID data, same graph, same basis, and I'm looking for my cursor to move. Here we go. Can someone find my cursor for me? There we go. So same graph, same triangle. I just put that triangle on there so you can kind of see that distance. COVID hits in like 1 month, our entire marketplace is upended. But if you look, since we've updated it, that separation is beginning to appear again. It's beginning to appear again. In fact, I'm going to, in the future, I'll probably recreate this on the same graphic, just acknowledge we have that 1 month spike. We're getting back to that competitive marketplace again, and we're beginning to see evidence of that. Wages really did not take a hit. Wage increases took a hit, but wages themselves really didn't during this process, and so it makes it difficult to try to plan that. The other challenge we have, and what we're going to be dealing with here, is kind of if you ever seen those videos of, you have this big picture of the earth and then you kind of zoom into an employer. We're going to kind of do a little bit of that with kind of some of the age projections for start at the state level and then kind of work our way down to your own data. But you can see that this graph is a series of 6 maps showing the aging of Wisconsin's population. And the darker blue you are, the older you're going to get in terms of a county population. And so you can see from 2015 all the way to 2040, that expected aging of Wisconsin, not at all unexpected. I often refer to, back when I was still in county government, I remember listening to Mark O'Connell talk about, what's going to happen when the baby boomers entirely exit the workforce. Are we going to have enough employees, so on and so forth? And it's a challenge. And it really is, and if we look at, northern Wisconsin in general is getting older and, finding that talent. In fact, Kelly and I were just talking in the back of the room. What are we going to do? My estimation in general is we're going to see a lot more automation. And we're going to look at, the services that we offer, whether it's public sector, private sector, anywhere in between, what is necessary versus what was nice to have. Because again, when you're lacking the bodies in the workforce, sometimes those tough decisions need to be made. Similarly, the millennial and forward analytics, again, if you've been part of, you are part of the counties association, but if you read any of the reports, this is straight from theirs from 2019. The data, I think, is relatively holding steady. But again, the dark green, the biggest exodus of millennial employee or millennial workers. And again, the challenge is if we're getting older and we're losing our younger workers, where's that next generation of worker coming in? And the reason why it's important to us isn't we're defining work. We do very, very limited staffing work, but it also has a direct relation to compensation. And when we get to your data, I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. But again, the aging and then the exodus of the younger employees is certainly a challenge, not just for Door County and beyond. And this is one of those slides I said, I don't want you to worry about this. This is more for your consumption after the fact. But as we start going through the data, and since I can't see it clearly, I'm going to have to put on my glasses. So as we work our way through, the first one is population ages 55 or older. According to the data, Door County is the 5th oldest county in the state of Wisconsin. And a lot of this information I'm going to be going through in the next few slides here are probably things that you either already know as fact or you thought you knew, and it's probably going to confirm what you thought you knew already. But again, that population is an important piece of the puzzle because again, that question for you as we start going through these next few slides are what does the future look like for Door County's employee population? And you're going to be tracking exactly what you're seeing in the data. On the first one, so this slide and the next slide is the same chart. This first one is all of your employees, all of your full-time and regular part-time employees. The next one will be just those employees subject to this study. So this would include, this one right here would include your police, your EMS, bargaining unit employees as well. But as you can see, at or over the age of 50, about 47, almost 48% of your workforce is at or over the age of 50. Why do we pick on the age of 50? Is that tends to be the age when people begin to look at their retirement prospects and say, am I on track? Do I have enough saved? What's my health insurance future look like? But that age 55 and above is an even more important number because then retirement's becoming a greater reality. In the public sector, in Wisconsin, if you are a law enforcement or protective service employee, ages 50 or 55 are your two magic dates for retirement. They tend to gravitate more towards 55, and it's almost always because of health insurance being one of the conversations. But for regular employees, age 57 is kind of that magic number as long as you've got the requisite number of years. And I always say this, that being eligible to retire and being able to retire are two different conversations. So my point is that age 55 or older, you have a solid third of your workforce that at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see exit just through natural turnover in the workforce. This does not include any other turnover that you might see. Somebody isn't cutting the mustard and you cut them loose on a probationary period. Somebody leaves for a different opportunity. This is going to be in addition to that. And so what we find, and in fact, Door County is one of the few that is still holding true to the 50% or pretty close to the 50% mark for age 50 or older. We see a lot of public sector employers going down to that 40% range for that age grouping. But your departments, especially as we look forward, your departments, especially your human resources function, is going to be spending a tremendous amount of time replacing employees. And this also does not include employees who might come on, join the county for a year or two, and then again take a different career path. If I look at just the study, I won't dwell on this as long. There we go. Back up one, Ken. So when we look at this, if I just take out the union personnel from this, now your number goes up to 52%. So the study group, the non-union group, you're looking at about 50%, 52% of your workforce at or over the age of 50. No matter how you slice it, it's going to be a tremendous amount of recruitment activity. And that doesn't also account for the other workload that needs to be done. When you deal with workplace culture or devising or revising policies to kind of bring you into the modern age and stay with the modern age, because things always tend to change, that you're going to have a disproportionate amount of time spent on recruiting in the foreseeable future. The same thing that we look at is kind of more from a retention standpoint. That here in this particular graph, you have 40% of your workforce with less than 5 years of service. Why do we use 5 years of service? Again, using rules of thumb, but I think it's pretty close that if you have the ability and are successfully able to maintain somebody's employment for 5 years, you found something redeeming with that employee, and hopefully they found something redeeming with you as an employer. And so it's my theory, and someday I'll test that theory, that people, once you reach that 5 years, the likelihood of you keeping them, I think, increases greatly. I think every month or every year you have somebody in the fold, that they stick around. But the question is, do you have the necessary tools, programs in place, including a competitive compensation structure to keep them in the workforce? And so again, this is all employees. But if I look at just the union or the non-union cut of this data, back up one. So that number jumps from 40% to 46%. Same story, but just a slightly different group, that you have more employees with lesser years of service in your non-union groupings. Also talking about the commuting and residency data, Ken provided me some information. Actually, the slides that you will have that I included, this is from New North, of which you're a member of, these slides here, these next few. And looking at the dark red being a net exodus of employees, and the blue colors being an influx of employees. And again, The southern part of the peninsula is losing employees. It's not a shock at all, being so proximate to the greater Green Bay area. I think the data shows that out, where the more populated areas with the shops and those sorts of things, seeing an influx of workers. So again, nothing to really, just kind of framing the question for you. Professional commuting, professional level employees, you can see that, that I would guess that most of them are going into Green Bay, as this chart or this table, I'll get this right eventually, map would suggest to you. The same thing for STEM occupations. Not a huge exodus, but again, you can see the concentration in Green Bay where that tends to be going. So you're situated perfectly for people to make that commute. And I think some of the data, helps explain that as well. And then the county's own information, looking at part-time employees, that first map, and full-time employees being the second map, that again, you see a pretty decent representation inside the county, where the employees are living for the most part where they work. Is that sustainable? Is a legitimate question, one that I don't have the answer to, and I think is something that you as a board, if you haven't been wrestling with it, you will be wrestling with it into the future. I would note that and it's really hard to see, but the part-time employees, there's a significant number of those less than age 30 that live outside the county. And there's a pretty decent mix of the full-time employees. And truthfully, that makes sense, especially when we start talking about some of the housing data and some of those other barriers. So in terms of the demographic data that we look at here, and again, these next three, so this one, the one after, and the one after that, tied together. So the first thing that we're looking at is what is the median value of owner-occupied housing units. Housing units for this purpose is defined as a home, an apartment, a condo, or a trailer home, something as a permanent residence and not necessarily a hotel room. And again, Door County's number is indicative of I think it's 4th or 5th highest in the state, 6th highest. Keep putting my glasses on and off. And again, I don't think that's any surprise based on, again, our conversations, our experience working with the county. And so we have median value of owner-occupied housing units, kind of ranking at 6. And I have a summary slide at the end here that will talk about that. The median household income, you're in the top third, being, at is it $59,000 a year. So again, nothing, you're in good standing, and the two should track. They're not tracking perfectly in terms of housing units against income. But when I look at using that comparison of looking at housing units price, median price to the median income, you are number 4 in the state in terms of that challenge. So what that is indicative to us is that especially for that younger generation of employee, those who are looking to make their first home purchase, there might be a barrier to purchase. I have any number of clients where it's difficult for employees to live in the place where they work. In the greater Madison area, I've had some of my professional colleagues who work out in some California communities where almost none of the employees work in the communities because there's such a high barrier to entry. But again, something I think as you look at this, how do we get workers to come into our community? And we've got other clients in this general vicinity where we've had similar conversations, that how do we avoid that trap of we hire somebody from the greater Green Bay area, great employee, but the temptation that if I have the opportunity to work in Door County or if I have the opportunity to work in Brown County, half-hour, 45-minute commute versus a 10, 15-minute commute, there's always that challenge. And so again, housing is a big part of that employment relationship. Nothing we can do about it, but I wanted to at least put that in front of you as something, as you continue your deliberations and discussions. Housing units versus population. The number of housing units you have, condos, apartments, houses, trailers, those sorts of things versus your population. This one floored me. And I guess I should have known, but you have almost as many housing units as you do residents. Again, makes perfect sense when you account for the seasonality of the people that come in and out of the community. But that's the Wisconsin average being, and where there was Wisconsin data, I tried to footnote it so you could at least get some perspective of what's, I don't want to use the word normal, because there's no such thing as normal when it comes to this sort of stuff. But I would also say that the housing units to population are probably more indicative. When you see those higher numbers, they are what I would consider to be vacation counties. The Northwoods, especially Vilas, I think if they're not number one, they're going to be pretty darn close. Yep, they're number one. And the same thing with the net new construction data that, and I want to be very careful with any of this information I'm sharing, that it's not a matter of some consultant not from Door County coming and saying, hey, you need to change all sorts of things. That you are who you are, you know who you are, but there's not a lot of economic development going on. So when you look at the levy growth, you're in that bottom section. If you see when I have those color coded, one's got the line through it, there's no one that meets that match, but it doesn't line up nicely and neatly. So I wanted to at least keep it in there. The point is that the new construction numbers aren't pushing the economic engine to help offset some of the other growth or other needed activities. So falling near the bottom of the heap on that one, and also the net new jobs. It's part of it is it's hard to create new jobs when you don't have the workforce to create those jobs. I mean, it really weighs on people in terms of making those decisions. But over the course of 2001 to 2017, the county came in at number 29 in terms of net new jobs for what's going on. And then the last piece for this one would be the equalized valuation. And this is just another way of kind of affirming exactly what that you have a large influx. In fact, I would say all of those down to the lighter purple color of about 107 equalized valuation per capita of 125 to 150. Anything above that ratio, you can make a strong argument that there is a strong seasonality to their occupancy. Vilas County being the top of the heap. Door County is right behind that. But then you look at the likes of Adams and Florence and Forest, and then you get down to southeast Wisconsin. That just tends to be the more affluent areas where people leave the Milwaukee, and then you get to the Ozaukee and Washington and Walworth County areas. But again, the point is those with a higher degree of seasonality tend to have a greater equalized valuation per capita. Whatever that means to you, I'll let you decipher that. But the point is, I think you have a lot of things that are barriers to employees coming into the community from an employment standpoint. And that's I guess, the main reason for putting this stuff out there. So again, the observations are things I've already commented on, but I'll let you decide what's important from that standpoint. I want to make certain that we talk about your pay structure and some of the things that we look at that, without doing any analysis, I shouldn't say any, this is one of the first layers of analysis, but not collecting any market data yet, or at least analyzing the market data, that we look at what are your current practices, and is the current structure reflective of what that intent was. So when we look at, if I work from my way from the bottom up, that it tells me with the bottom of your pay structure being about 87.5%, but I also know that we work in the real world. It's not always possible to bring people into the organization at the lowest rate of your structure. But generally speaking, going from the bottom up, that people are hired pretty darn near the bottom of the structure and are working their way through. Good discipline on the part of the county to do that. And if you look as you work your way through, and once you get about halfway through, I'm a little bit leery in terms of that compa ratio. Compa ratio being, what is the midpoint of my grade versus what am I paid currently? What's that ratio? What's that percentage? And that's how we get that. And so the 89%, people are 89% of that control point for their grade on average. When you get to that middle section, sometimes it gets a little bit skewed because you have people who might have been with you 10, 15, 20 years, but now they just got promoted to a much higher position. And so maybe they are lower in their new pay grade where they would have been higher in their old pay grade. So there's some noise that sometimes occurs, but by and large, you've got very good discipline in your pay structure, and you don't have a lot of things that need correcting where you're starting people at 95 to 100% of the marketplace. Now you've got a whole bunch of new employees in the same spot as people who've been here for a while. So very first impression, and that might change as we get further into the process in terms of where you stand in the marketplace, but you've got good practices relating to your compensation management. In terms of comparing to the marketplace, I said I was going to talk about this one in terms of why do we have a larger market? Why were we talking 29 employers last time through? Is because that there is a mix that we try to look at. So your top level positions, it might be more of a statewide view of the world, where your professional managerial type positions, maybe it's more a little bit more compact. Maybe we'll look at Northeast Wisconsin, maybe a little bit beyond that, but you're trying to be competitive where you're fishing or you're hunting for employees. But then I would say a lot of the hourly jobs tend to be a much more local recruitment pool. And so you usually have 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 recruitment pools for various levels of the organization, and trying to do it in the confines of a single pay structure. So when we talk about marketplace, there's 2 general marketplaces that we end up wrestling with these projects. The first one I think is more traditional. The old bargaining world, it was who is like us. Yeah, we know Brown County is just down the street, but who's like us? Kewanee is like us. Oconto, Shawano, Menominee, or Marinette. That we can align with them from a population standpoint, maybe from some other demographics, and let's put our head in the sand. Let's ignore Brown County. And I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying that was the traditional model with bargaining, and that is helpful. And I think it provides you necessary information. But if you're not also looking at what I call the competitive marketplace, includes employers who aren't like you, but you are in active competition for that talent. And that's where I think the Brown counties, Outagamie counties, on down the list begin to make more sense, because again, you're playing in that marketplace and you're competing in that marketplace for the exact same employees. There's overlap, that, you certainly don't say, well, yeah, Kewanee, they're right next door. You can't ignore their practices but you also have to take a larger view of the world. And that's exactly what we did last time through. And so when we look at that, did I skip a slide? I did. So just a couple of things here in terms of commuting patterns. This is just the graphic that they supplied in that report, 2013. I would expect a new version with this new census coming out whenever they get that settled. But by and large, it doesn't tell you anything that you didn't already know, which is people who live in Door County work in primarily Brown and Kewanee counties. It falls off pretty quickly after that. People who work in Door County live, so again, you have your own residence, that makes sense, but you're also looking at Kewanee and Brown. So that's your 2 major pockets. And so you could say, let's just compare to those 2 employers and we'll be done with it. But again, I don't think that answers the larger question of when it comes time to hire a supervisor, or a manager, or department head, are you playing in the right space and are you competing with the right talent? The other part, and this was they're now the Wisconsin Policy Forum, but they used to be called the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance. They ran a report about 8 years ago. It was actually a really well thought out, well-reasoned report as relates to the different regional economies. And whether they got it precisely right, that's not my place to debate, but I think the interesting point is that there are different economies, and we see that as we work our way across the state, where you get put into that Northeast Wisconsin, and this was kind of the anchor last time through for the county incorporating some more of these, the greater Fox Valley, greater Green Bay area counties and cities as part of the mix. And so last time through, and you see this color coding, and I will acknowledge that there's a color coding error on this next slide here, that I tried to look at the segmented populations. I included Marinette in the Southeast Wisconsin. The green is Southeast Wisconsin. The blue is the greater Fox Valley, Green Bay area. Red being Northwoods, and purple being central Wisconsin. I did that for my purposes, but also for the conversation. I think as we work our way through, I think it's going to be helpful to at least be able to answer to you 2-3 months down the road when we come back with a set of recommendations. You know, those counties that I think have been traditional comparables, Marinette, Oconto, Oneida, Line Wade, especially, what impact do they have on your pay structure? Because I think, again, one of the concerns that we hear from time to time is, are we truly competitive? Are we able to bring the talent into the organization that we need? And the only way we can answer that is with the employer's assistance. You know, we're not involved in the day-to-day recruitments. That when problems start happening or the inability to find jobs, that usually the first indication of a problem is when an HR director or an administrator calls us up on the phone or drops us an email and says, hey, we're having problems with these 3, 4, 5, 20 positions. You know, it could be any number. What do we do? Or is it time to look at this? And that's usually, like I said, the first call to action. But I do think that, one, we've got a solid representation. Not any one organization is going to drag a number up or drag a number down. There's enough representation. And also having a really good anchoring in private sector data with the sources we're using. So again, I think that's one of those things that we're going to have to ask and answer to have some comfort level with the final recommendations. And then the last piece of this is kind of talking in general about some of the philosophical or strategy-based decisions. For us, when we do this work, it is impossible to have this conversation without at least taking the total rewards conversation into consideration. That if anybody would stand in front of you and say that money is the only answer to the employment relationship, they would be lying to you. And it's so much, and in fact, you know, trying to condense it to just even 3 buckets is impossible. The first one being that compensation. That is I was just reading an article the other night, talking about pay adequacy and pay satisfaction. That pay has to be adequate first before you can get into that satisfactory zone. And I think we're beyond the adequacy piece, and now the satisfaction being evidenced of, you know, your recruitment and retention activities from an employment standpoint. But also as part of that equation, you know, it is rare that I get in front of a board or a council where we don't have to have a conversation about benefits. You know, that yes, we're paying competitively, but what about this competitive benefits package? And my commentary, and sometimes to the frustration of the boards I work with, is that they are 2 parallel conversations. That if you are paying competitively, then it doesn't mean that you should discount or accelerate your benefits package. And the same thing, if you have a competitive benefits package, it doesn't mean you should discount your pay plan, because both are equally important in that relationship. If I'm looking to, even if I'm not looking to apply for a job at Door County, if I look at as an applicant that the pay is inadequate or not competitive with what I'm currently getting paid, I don't care what the health insurance is or the pension is. I'm not going to give it another look. So it's both of those things being equally important and need to be addressed on an equal footing. But that last piece oftentimes gets the short end of the stick when it comes to these conversations. That is the overall employee experience. And this is, and I've seen many of my colleagues and friends in this business still, that they spend so much time on recruiting and putting out fires that this employee experience doesn't always receive the attention that it really needs to. You know, creating that culture where employees want to come and work here, and having that connected and engaged workforce, and having good evaluation tools. You know, performance management isn't just a, hey, how bad did you do last year? It's how can we help you grow as an employee and contribute more to the workforce, and all those sorts of things that are necessary for that. I would argue that compensation and benefits are kind of the base for some of these conditions for employee experience and employee engagement. But it's really the culture that will decide whether an employee comes and stays with you for the long term. And so, you know, as you look at this, you know, whatever you can do to kind of focus on some of those efforts, I think, again, will also be rewarding to you. I dropped this one in here because it's sometimes people say, well, we're going to be looking at the same thing. Are we going to get the same or different results as last time? The first answer is, I don't know. I mean, that the market works in mysterious ways sometimes. Some jobs accelerate, sometimes they decelerate in the marketplace. But also as part of our processes, there's any number of variables that we try to hold as consistent as possible in this work. So when we look at, the number of benchmark employers, I'm not recommending that we cut any out of the equation, but I do think when we get to the end, we have to take that look and say, what is the effect that this grouping has? And that's an easier analysis. On the benchmark jobs, the surveys utilized, and there's different practices with surveys that we have to be mindful of as consultants that, different participation across different years can have an effect, those sorts of things. One of the questions, I'm going to wind this process down, so I'm going to put a pin in this bullet point in terms of the placement in the marketplace. That right there is a big conversation for employers. And again, like I said, I'll talk about that in just a few moments. But we also know that every organization or most organizations staff their jobs differently. As a county, you have from county to county to county, you probably have the most likeness from different organizations. But even still, if I were to walk into your human service department or your highway department or your sheriff's department, I guarantee you are approaching those programs and services differently than Kiwani, differently than Brown, differently than any other organization, even though you have the same requirements. And so one organization might look at a job and say, we need somebody with a bachelor's degree in this job. And another organization looks at that exact same job and says, no, we can get by with an associate's. And if there's compelling reasons and arguments and it aligns with the duties and responsibilities, you're going to have differences from project to project. So the point is that there's lots of variables that can affect the results, and we're trying to keep those as stable as possible when we're looking at a market update. In terms of the questions, the policy questions that usually fall on a board or a management team, what is that market? We've talked a lot about that, but again, a very important piece of that puzzle, and we're well underway. That market placement. Do you want to lag the marketplace? I will tell you, you can't do that. You can. I mean, you can do any one of these, but from a practical standpoint, if you're lagging the marketplace, you will be a training ground and you will experience higher than normal turnover. That people, in the public sector, wages are transparent. What one department or what entity does is shared with others. Do you want to lead the marketplace? Normally, I would say no. But we're seeing evidence of that out and about in some of these tougher areas. And I'll use some examples. And again, I have a slide at the end here, and just a couple slides here that we'll talk about. What type of a structure? You made that decision once. That you looked at it and said, we would like a hybrid structure where it's predictable steps to an estimated market rate. And if we're going to pay you above the market, we want to see some performance to justify that. Does that still apply? We come into this with the assumption that you want to hold, but that's a question that you certainly could ask and resolve through this process. And that last piece is, how do you implement? In a market update, it really depends on what those final results are. And again, I have no idea what those results look like, probably for another month or two until we get the data in the system. But it can be expensive, it can be cheap, and in a market update, the answer might be you don't need to do anything. I just finished one a couple weeks ago, a market update for a client, and you could not tell the difference between their current rates of pay. They had maintained the structure, but it doesn't always work out that way. So again, if it doesn't line up, and if we do recommend changes, that implementation plan is equally important. Come on. Just want to touch on this very quickly, because I think this is where some of our challenges in the public sector, I think these are on accidental 30-second timers, by the way. But as we're talking about this, and PayScale, which is a big data warehouse, and they also do a lot of thought research on employee compensation, the what are you paid? That's easy, right? I see my paycheck, see my check stub, and so the what is going on here. How? We're going to measure the marketplace. We're going to go, to the 50th percentile, and all those sorts of things. The where. That's where. So the what through the where, and as I say here, 87% of organizations fall between what and where. And I would say probably 100% of the public sector organizations probably fall in that zone. Again, with all the transparency, it's the why. Why are we paying what we are? And then the whoa, as they have it, full transparency. Well, guess what? In the public sector, you've got the whoa transparency. Everybody knows what everybody else gets paid. Everybody knows the increase that somebody else got, or at least has the ability to find that out. Maybe it's not published on a billboard outside of town, but one open records request and that data becomes pretty transparent. It's interesting because this survey was largely private sector employers. Only 31% of private sector employers said, yeah, we want to go that far. So you've got it. In my note at the bottom of that page, talks about that most public sector organizations are at that whoa level, full transparency, but oftentimes they skip over the why. Why are we paying what we're paying? We want to be competitive. And, every once in a while I'll walk into an organization, it could be public or private, where I'll look at a strategic planning document that they've put together. And in that document, they say, we want the best and brightest employees. Well, do best and brightest equate to the 50th percentile of the marketplace? And again, knowing money is not the only thing in that equation, but again, trying to get to this notion of why it is what we're doing. Here is our philosophy. Here's our approach, is something that I think organizations don't spend enough time on, especially when you're making a shift in that philosophical approach. The last piece I have for this morning is this kind of just laying the groundwork for some of these questions that follow relating to what are other organizations doing. And again, the survey was dominated by private sector. There was some public sector influence, but I would say that some of these numbers are probably higher when we get to the public sector. But how do organizations build a pay structure? Almost 90%, and it's consistent across 3 different surveys, that you have 88, 89, 87% at or near the 50th percentile. Why do I say near? Sometimes that 50th percentile or median is substituted with average. And so, but those numbers track pretty closely with one another. How many have formal structures? For years we went and we would witness in the private sector that some of them, we're just going to have a market price and we'll just update that number twice a year or once a year, whatever their philosophy is. More and more organizations, especially since pay equity is one of the things that are dominating our conversations, having a formal pay structure is that pathway. You have that. So you're no discussion there. A huge growth. If you look between 2010 and 2019 in terms of bonuses, sign-on bonuses, retention bonuses, pay bonuses in lieu of pay increases. It's easier to give, if I have an employee who's making, I'll just pick an arbitrary number, $50,000 a year, and they did a good job, is it more beneficial for me to give them a $2,500 bonus that keeps their pay at $50,000 a year? Or is it more cost efficient to give them a pay increase to $52,500 that keeps building on it? So again, you see a lot of organizations going down that path of bonuses or other incentives. And the other one, and this is one that, and I don't care if it skips past it now, Ken, but that last slide being, more than one salary structure. I've been doing the consulting work for about 7.5 years now. And in that time, I can count probably on one hand the number of public sector organizations who said, we want more than one structure. And I'm excluding those entities that have a nursing home or some other operation like that might be different, because then we'll almost always do separate structures. But the general feeling is that if it's good for our top employee in the organization, it's good for the bottom employee. And generally speaking, I think that's a laudable approach. But the way that the world has worked, and I would look at the private sector, and I would argue that the private sector can take just as many cues from the public sector as we can from them. So neither side is I shouldn't say side because it implies negativity, but neither sector, I think, leads the way on this. But this notion of maybe it's time to look at different structures for different groups of employees, and again, I think, the data will help root that out, but it's again, my personal professional opinion. If we fast forward 5 to 10 years, I think you're going to start to see here's a management structure, or here's an exempt salaried employee structure, and here's an hourly employee structure, because again, I think your demands are going to be that much greater. So from my standpoint, and my whole purpose for being here today is to lay some of these things out, because if we come back in 2-3 months to say, here's some changes we're recommending, I want you to know some of those underlying reasons and some of those underlying challenges that are before us in making those recommendations. So again, no decisions being requested today. Just wanted to lay some basic, some pretty detailed information in front of you to help facilitate the discussion process later on. Any questions before I leave? I guess.
Sorry, I was having a hard time hearing you.
Go ahead, Vinny.
And the couple questions that I have regard what you're, and it could be for the future to answer, but what you're seeing in vacation specific places as far as, does any of the studying that's kind of one dynamic. As far as public sector, I hear a lot about private sector, thinking of millennials like in a workplace, such as flexibility, culture, as you mentioned.
I'm sorry, you keep cutting in and out.
Are you seeing the transfer to the public sector?
Give me the mic.
Hey, Vinny, could you maybe chat or send me a message on your questions? You're not coming through. You keep on breaking in and out.
Okay, is that any better?
No, it is, yes. Try one more time. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll make it shorter. Just wondering if you're seeing some of the things that seem like trends in the private sector as far as millennial workforce wanting things like being able to work from home, have more flexibility in time on, time off, different perks that are related to work culture, such as providing childcare, things like that. Are you seeing those transfer to a public sector?
Let me answer the question on what came to mind, and if I actually answered your question, I trust that you'll tell me. I think, generally speaking, finding people to come to the public sector doesn't have the same hold, and I'm going to use an event. It is not meant to be raised for political purposes. I'm not going to express my opinion one way or the other, but I think Act 10 changed the landscape for public employment in a very meaningful way. I think the first one is the sharing of the pension costs amongst employees. Even at a shared basis, it's one of the better pension plans in the entire world. There's zero complaints about the pension system in and of itself, but the hook that the public sector had at one point where here's the pension and it's completely paid for by the employer, or if I were in a private sector and if I had a 401k, maybe my employer matches 2, 3, 4, 5% of my contributions. That's my choice. Here, an employer paid pension, there's less of a hook for prospective employees from that standpoint. I would also say that as health insurance has evolved in that same 10-year period, I think by and large people are much more competitive, where in a private sector employer, you might pay closer to 20, 25% of your premium. Public sector is still gravitating in the 10 to 15% range. So my point with raising those two things, and they're certainly not the only things, is that any advantages the public sector had from a benefit standpoint haven't been erased. That would be a complete lie. But they've been eroded during that time where it isn't as much of a lure. I think the second thing is more of a generational aspect. One, and again, this is not a Door County comment, but more of a public sector in general. I think we've done a very poor job in the public sector of articulating our value and the meaning in what some of these jobs are doing. You have any number of people in this community who are keeping the community safe from different hazards and harms, and doing very difficult and otherwise thankless jobs, but they have a high degree of meaning. And the reason why I use that particular term, if you read any of the work published by the Gallup Corporation on, the American workplace, in fact, if you can get your hands, it's free of charge. The State of the American Workplace is a report that they publish every 3-4 years. Very great insights in terms of what employees are expecting and how to operate. But one of the words they talk about, and the newer generations of employees talk about meaning in their job and being able to articulate that to a candidate, to a prospective social worker. I would suspect that many of them going into that field know, some of the meaning and the positive effects of being in that environment. But again, from a recruitment standpoint, getting people to do that is difficult. I think the other piece of the newer generations, and I'm always careful to talk about this because I rewind back when I was 21, 22 years old, that, my career trajectory was I spent 3.5 years at my first county I worked for, 2.5 for the second, and then I spent 13 years. And the reason why I'm kind of couching it with that is I think younger people in general tend to hop jobs a little bit more until they're finding their way in the world and find the place that fits for them. So I don't want to just categorically say that millennials and Gen Zs, they just are job hoppers, because I think that they get a very, that's a very short-sighted view of that generation. But that being said, I think the data is beginning to show more and more that this notion of, I'm going to use a very, the old mentality, I want to get a job with the county and that's where I'm going to spend my entire career. That this is the destination for a career. And I'm not saying it's a bad place to work by any stretch of the imagination, but that mindset of going anywhere to work for 25, 30 years is not the anchor for the mindset of most of the people in the workplace today. So finding people to come in to the public sector and keeping people in the public sector. And I'm having more and more conversations with employers about what is the career expectancy for a particular occupation. I'm not going to pick on any particular job for fear of offending anybody, but is every job intended to be somebody comes and they camp out for an entire career? When I say camp out, meaningful, productive employment, but the point is that here's my job and 30 years later I have the same job. That's just not happening anymore. And you have people having different careers during the course of their lifetime. So the employment relationship in general has gotten more difficult, but the sales pitch for the public sector, especially with tight budgets, and we are so service oriented. I think this pandemic has illustrated those jobs. We could probably get by with remote work. But it's also illustrated the severe difficulties in dealing with some of the populations that we serve in, especially in county government, that you can't be remote. We need bodies and we need the person-to-person contact. But I do think moving forward that at the very, very least, you're going to have some jobs in this you could have done in California, as opposed to, being on site at Door County. But other ones, like I said, I think you're going to have to dig your heels in and say, this is an on-site type of employment relationship. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it was a pretty long-winded response. And hopefully I touched on most of
We
your
got to
points.
keep going on time. So I think there's a few more, but we got to be a little more
Okay.
time sensitive.
Alexis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was very helpful, and I have a lot of questions. But for the first one that I think you can answer today, you had a slide that broke down when we talk about the pay structure and where the younger employees are and in their structure versus the and it was broken down by age, so I'm just older, but the older folks were maybe more seniority. Do you familiar with the slide I'm talking about? I think so. I can't, yeah. I can see about to the front of in front of me.
Me too.
But,
That's why I keep putting this in.
so when we talk about equity, looking at the pay structure through an equity lens, can you break that down and make sure that I understand that and because what I got out of that was the older folks that have been around a little bit longer are at the higher end of their pay structure, whereas we're bringing in younger, lower service folks at the lowest end of their structure, of their range. Is that what I got from that slide?
Yeah, I didn't look at it with age, but I mean, it stands to reason the more you've been here, the older you are. I mean, those two things track pretty closely. And I think by and large that's the way it should track. Now, the question is, if you are truly in a pure from beginning to end in a pay for performance world where every pay decision was based on performance, you might have different responses. And that this data might track differently. Your structure, the way you have it, is up to 100%. So if I had 100%, that means you're at the control point for your grade. That it tracks at least from the standpoint of, do you have hiring discipline where you're not bringing somebody in at step 13? Or you don't have steps at that high, but you get my point. That first indication is that this looks good. The next thing we're going to look at, and will be in one of the charts, is we will plot out job evaluation score versus midpoint, so you can get a sense of, is that intact? And from a pay equity standpoint, what I like both, and that's kind of why I dropped in that slide on the job evaluation system, is we don't look at years of service. We don't look at performance. We don't look at gender or race. It's purely the duties, responsibilities, and requirements of the job. And it's been tested. In fact, not only has it been tested on hundreds of projects, public and private and everywhere in between over the years, but we do some work in Minnesota as well. And when we work in Minnesota, they have state laws requiring pay equity testing. And every single time we do one of those, we pass with flying colors. So I'm confident that the job evaluation system is valid from that standpoint. Pay practices look like it's fairly disciplined, but I can't root out any of those disparities that may or may not be there. And I would guess may not, closer to the not versus the may part.
Yeah, thank you. I had one other question, maybe more for the chair and the administrator. At the end of the presentation, there was a few areas where the board can have input on policy on how the study and structure is done. I'm just curious what the process for this body versus does that kind of decision be made at the administrative committee level, or how is that going to work?
When we first did this about 5 years ago, we brought the same type of presentation to the county board. And as a county, at that time, we made a presentation that should we be at that 50th percentile or should we be more aggressive in terms of our pay plan, in terms of, because of other factors, whether you consider it housing, the geography, and so forth. And there was an option to, I guess, weight it more to be more aggressive. And at that time, the county board made a decision to stay more at the competitive or the 50th percentile. You would have that, I guess, same type of impact on that decision in my mind, because that is a policy decision. So I guess that would be, in my mind, where the county board would weigh in terms of our philosophy, in terms of how we craft that final wage structure. So that's where the input would come in.
Nissa?
Oh, there we go. Got myself unmuted. Thank you. So a couple of years ago when we could actually go places and do things at the WIA conference, I went to a session where it talked about the average age of counties, and it mentioned specifically Door County being on the older end and what we expected to be like in, I think it was 2030. And that while the rest of the state got older, we kind of stabilized. And I asked if the reason why we were stable is because we already hit that age level and that we aren't really looking at getting any older or changing on average. And the answer to that was yes. Is that still kind of the thinking where we have already hit more of the retirement age, so we aren't really going to change structurally age-wise in the county for a while?
Well, the chart, I mean, just going back to the chart does show that the county will be aging, but I mean, part of that is true. There's a math in terms of just the way the categories are built. Once you hit over a certain age, then they're not actually breaking it down into further categories. But the one chart does show that we are, over the next 15 years, we are going to be, I guess, moving up in those categories that are defined. But once you hit that top category, it's not further defined more than that. So.
Right, and what it was going by was percentage that we were going, our growth of the average aging age was less than the average county comparatively because we've already hit that average age. I don't know if that makes sense. That our percentage of retired people wasn't really going to drastically change compared to other counties, that we get older, but our level wasn't hitting as quick.
So my only answer, I not having seen the data, I think my only response I would have you track, and I noticed this in some of the population data as I was looking, I think from 2001 to 2017 or 19, doesn't matter, that there's a number of counties, especially in northern Wisconsin counties, where they're losing population. So as people get older, and unfortunately, and I'll be there someday too, that, you know, as that population, you know, passes on, do you have either through birth rates or through migration, people moving back into the county? Or is it just a matter of we wake up 20 years from now, you know, if you're sitting at 28,000 population today, are you sitting at 25? Are you sitting at 35? I have no knowledge of or no control over that. But I think that's the part you want to look at. I do believe, just based on what I've seen there, you probably if you're not hit the critical mass in terms of the statistics, you're almost there. But it's that, that's why I put that millennial slide up there as well, is that if you're losing your youngest employment base and you're getting older at the same time, that's where the concern would come in for me, that you would want to at least, you know, this is the type of conversation that probably takes, you know, a good several years to ramp up and take meaningful action to begin to affect change in that regard. But you're not alone. I think there's a lot of counties and cities in the state and actually the country that are wrestling with the same issues you are.
Dave Enigal?
Okay, thank you.
This question is probably for the administrator. I don't think the presenter would know it, but remind me, this wage study that we're talking about here, and when we're talking about the longer term employees that have a higher income level than the wage stage solos, isn't that part of just the way we used to pay employees? You know, we can't very well take pay out of their income, you know, they're grandfathered in at that stage. And as we replace them, then the replacements would get within that schedule. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's partially correct, but again, you could still grow within our wage structure under the hybrid that we have. Once you hit the midpoint or that 100 percentile, you still have the ability to grow up to the 115th percentile. And then when you get to the 115th percentile, then it is strictly a bonus situation in that sense. So you will see a lot of the employees, what you'll see when we converted over in 2016, we have a lot of employees that dropped below now that 115th mark, but we do have a significant amount of employees between that 100th and 115th percentile.
But still, that should slowly be, as they retire, that level of 115% should be going down.
Somewhat, yes, yes.
Thank you.
Cara?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed that you're using age as an indicator a lot, but I was wondering why you weren't using race and gender, because I know that the information that came out, the first thing that comes to mind is in December, the country lost so many jobs, right? It was like a ton of jobs. And when you look at that data through other intersects, it became that white men actually gained jobs. And it was women particularly that lost the jobs. And if you go more specific, it was women of color that lost the jobs. So I know because you're using that age, I was just wondering why you said you weren't using the race and gender data as well. Just because I think it's important.
It's important, but I think from an employment standpoint, race and gender are more, what are you doing as a county to encourage that sort of investment in those populations from a business standpoint? For us, it's talking about the availability of workers, period. Regardless of age, race, or whatever, that we're looking at, you have a population that's getting older. Doesn't matter, you know, the race, you have a population that's getting older. Regarding some of those other factors, I think it cuts across all of those things. I'm not saying you should ignore them or you shouldn't take those into account, but those are more from a board politics standpoint as you're putting together your strategic planning documents or working with economic development. What are we doing to encourage these types of businesses? That's where that occurs. But from a workforce analysis, trying to stay as high level as possible without trying to cut into and really, you could go down that path. I don't know that it provides any value from what's going to happen at the macro level. The micro level is important. but we're trying to deal with the macro things right now.
Just because COVID jobs, have been lost to women, mostly because of things like childcare, and they're doing more of the labor at home and stuff like that. So I think that there is a use for that information as well even when it comes to accounting level.
But from a compensation standpoint, because we don't, and like I talked about our job evaluation system, that we try not to care about race or gender as part of that equation. We want to strip away all of those extraneous characteristics and looking at the duties and responsibilities and requirements of the job at its purest essence. And again, then from that, now what is our recruitment strategy? Civil rights compliance or equal employment opportunity. Are you putting yourself in a position where you have a diverse workforce? That's more on the implementation side of things as opposed to the recommendation from a pay standpoint. So it's valuable information, but in terms of where you stand in the marketplace, there's not. The market is that we don't get data when we collect our survey data. This is a female occupation. This is a male occupation. And there certainly aren't race-based occupations, that we deal with. And so we're working at from a wage and marketplace standpoint. And if we were looking at the pay equity practices, then we would do a deeper dive. In fact, we're doing a fairly large project for a utility in Iowa right now, looking at performance as controlling factors, race and gender as controlling factors. But that's more on a deeper dive of a pay equity analysis and pay practices, as opposed to designing a pay structure.
Morgan?
Thank you. So I'm wondering if we have a good grasp on how each of these age groups, you have it kind of broken down by the under 30s, the 30 to 40, and as you get older, how each of those groups prioritize their compensation versus their benefits versus their employee culture. I would argue a lot of my peers, like 30, 40, 40-year-olds, we've taken pay cuts in order to have a better work-life balance. We've foregone benefits for a higher wage. Like compensation doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for everyone. So as those groups get older, as those shift, do you know where those priorities kind of shift with that?
Yeah, and I used to, in fact, if you look back at the old, like 2015, 2016 presentations, I think we had slides in there that talked about benefit or compensation preferences by groupings. I think one slide was by Z, millennials, X, boomers, on up the line. That they're absolutely, your point is that when I was 21 years old and just joining the workforce, if it wasn't for my boss and mentor telling me you need to put money aside for retirement, that wasn't a big deal to me. I was invincible. I wasn't ever going to get sick. So health insurance wasn't, at the top on the list. There's absolutely trade-offs, and all of a sudden you switch over to that mode, and now I have a family. Now I got to provide health insurance, and it's pretty darn expensive. So I got to have a decent job that provides that. And oh, by the way, I think I want to retire in 30 years, and so I need to start socking money away. Maybe I didn't think about that when I was 21, 22 years. So there's always that substitution as you get further, and the data pretty clearly tracks that. But again, trying to develop a compensation structure, a uniform structure, you could have a structure that says, well, you don't want the benefits. And for years, if not decades, employers have been very paternalistic or maternalistic, that we're trying to watch out for you. You should invest. And so that's when you saw in the 90s, more of a proliferation of automatic opt-in for 401k programs or deferred compensation, that we're going to decide for you. We're going to enroll you in this program. You can decide if you opt out. Same thing with health insurance. We're going to enroll you. You decide if you opt out. So there's absolutely trade-offs. But again, trying to devise a structure, I think it's become more of a conversation. If I rewind back to the mid 90s, all the rage at the time was cafeteria plans. That here's health insurance, here's vacation, and here's how much each one of those is worth. And so we think you should have at least 2 weeks of vacation, but if you want more, you can buy up. If you want a different health insurance program, but we're going to say we're only going to spend, I'll pick an arbitrary number, we're only going to spend $20,000 a year per employee on benefits. You figure out how they're spent. We're beginning to hear some talk of that sort of philosophy coming back for exactly what you're talking about. Different generations value different things. But trying to put that into a pay program where all of a sudden, 1 year, I'm really, really interested in pay. And the next year, I'm not interested in pay so much, but I don't want to lose that pay. Your lifestyle adjusts to your paycheck, the way it typically works. And so I'm up here, now I want more benefits. They don't take that pay away from me. That's often the challenge we find when we're trying to work in those sorts of environments.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We're going to take a 10-minute recess. And we'll be back at